Welcome into the midweek mailbag show presented to you by Fantasy Points. My name is Nick Skrip, and on the show every single week, I take questions from the community and answer them here. All of our questions today come from our Fantasy Points subscriber Discord. Big incentive to actually be a subscriber is to be part of that community Discord, not just because you get to ask questions for this podcast, but the Fantasy Points staff members are in that Discord interacting with the subscribers on a daily basis. It's a true community. We got a couple questions here today. One is going to take up most of this podcast. We have the final week for most leagues regular season and then the fantasy football playoffs. So it's important to get dubs this week, to have some questions answered and get a grasp about what is actually going on in the fantasy football world. So the first question here, Chip_6. Is Swift a top 10 running back going forward? So since returning from that shoulder injury, he returned in week 8. It was frustrating to see his usage the first 5 games back. Week 8, he saw 55% of the snaps, 10 touches. And then weeks 9, 10, 11, 12, he played under 35% of the snaps in all of those with a high of 9 touches. He wasn't completely busting because of scoring 3 touchdowns during that span, but it made a lot of people wonder if they could even put him in lineups because he was not touching the ball enough. He wasn't playing enough. Week 13 comes around, though. 51% of the snaps played, 18 total touches, scored again, 21.1 fantasy points, running back 4 for the week. He opened up the season well as the running back 3 with 26.5 fantasy points week 1. And then he was the RB7 the next week with 16.7 fantasy points. Last season, Swift missed some time as well, but he had 5 weeks above 22 fantasy points. The one issue that comes to mind is obviously Jamal Williams' presence. He still had 11 touches in week 13. In the opening 2 weeks where Swift was also successful, he had at least 11 touches as well. Nobody in the league has more red zone touches than Williams' 44 or more touchdowns than his 14 for the running back position. So obviously, he could take away from the upside for Swift in that area just because he's been good there. He's been good there. If we look ahead to the schedule here, week 14, Minnesota, they're tied for the 12th most fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. Week 15, the Jets, 21st when it comes to that category. Week 16, Carolina, the 9th most fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. And then week 17, my Chicago Bears, 5th most fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. So 3 out of 4 of DeAndre Swift's final matchups are against top 12 matchups on paper for the running back position. Coming into the season, personally, I had Swift, I believe, as my RB4. Obviously, I believe in the talent. As long as he is getting touches, I don't see how he can't potentially be a top 12 running back rest of season, just knowing that the schedule is good and knowing his history the last 2 seasons, this season and last season, of when he is healthy and getting the work, what he does on the football field with that dual threat ability that he has. Next question, Irv. Is Zonovan Knight for real, or was last week a matchup thing? So Zonovan Knight, top 12 performance in a top 12 matchup versus the Vikings in week 13, 15 attempts for 90 yards, 5 receptions. I'm pretty sure one of his carries accounted for over 50% of his total rushing yards, but you got to give the guy credit for his performing without Michael Carter in the mix. Another positive sign when we look at this Jets schedule is that they draw Detroit, Jacksonville, and Seattle for the fantasy playoffs. It's a solid running back schedule in comparison to others. Michael Carter will return, though. I'm not sure if it's going to be week 14, but week 7 through 11, he played over 50% of the snaps in 3 out of 4 of those games, never was under 50%. I think Knight can carve out the power early down role potentially that we thought James Robinson might have, but I feel like it's still going to be a split in Michael Carter's favor. So hang on tonight. Hang on to Zonovan Knight. It's a plus fantasy playoff schedule, but kind of temper the expectations that he's going to get high volume on a weekly basis. I still think that Michael Carter is going to lead the backfield, but he might have earned himself an extended role in this offense, which could be important in those better matchups. So the last question is where I'm going to spend the bulk or the majority of this podcast, just kind of ranting about it. But Anthony FF asks, who are some fantasy football risers heading into the fantasy playoffs? So I'm just going to spit out some facts and stats of some things that I've noticed recently and go from there. But James Cook, you want to mention him, a prime example of why you should stash rookies in good offenses that teams invested in. The Buffalo Bills drafted him in the second round. He was a good stash. They're a great offense, one of the best in the NFL. Season high 43% of the snaps played to Devin Singletary's 44% in week 13. 20 total touches in comparison to Singletary's 13. Season high 16.5 fantasy points. What was big for PPR leagues is the 6 receptions. So seeing him have season highs in snap percentage, receptions, fantasy points, that's a good sign. It's a good sign because we've seen historically the Bills have tried out a bunch of different running backs while also giving Devin Singletary work. They tried Zach Moss, Matt Breida, tried to go get J.D. McKissick, and they might have found somebody that actually can lean more on with James Cook. Keenan Allen, back to form. Hopefully you hung on to him if you were contending. A lot of narratives get created when older players miss extended time. Just flicked a bottle cap in my face here. When older veterans miss time. In reality, Keenan Allen has barely missed time across his last 5 seasons. Back-to-back weeks with a touchdown, 12.4, then 15.9, then 20.8 fantasy points. That's a great trend to have for a wide receiver one on a team that Justin Herbert is on. He had 14 targets this past week. Darius Slayton, I want to just throw his name out there. Slayton was second to Hodgins in fantasy points scored with 15 this past week, but he's the guy you want rest of the season for the Giants wide receiver core. He has receiving yard upside that's been on display. 90 receiving yards in week 13, 63 plus receiving yards in 5 straight games with 23, with 2 out of 3 of those being 86 plus yards. So he's truly hitting some good numbers in the receiving yard department. Second time in 4 weeks, he's had 15 fantasy points. So he's in that flex category. Have to talk about Garrett Wilson, who is on a tear with the help of Mike White. In Mike White's last 2 starts for the Jets, Wilson has had 8 and then 15 targets, 95 and then 162 receiving yards, 2 total touchdowns, 26.4 and 24.2 fantasy points. Talk about a potential 2022 version of what we saw last year in 2021 with rookie Amon-Ra St. Brown as we near the fantasy football playoffs. Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott, they're continuing to coexist well for fantasy. 21.8, 36.9, 8.1, 24.6 fantasy points. The last 4 for Pollard. Zeke has scored 16 plus in all 3 of his last games. Across the last 4 games, both Dallas running backs have combined for 9 total touchdowns. They have Houston this coming week. Jahan Dotson, he's a guy I really liked out of this draft class. The Commanders do have a bye this week, but he played the highest snap percentage with 79% since returning from injury. He caught 5 of his 9 targets. He scored his 5th touchdown of the season. This is a guy that the Commanders spent a first-round draft pick on. He opened up the season scoring over 17 fantasy points his first 2 weeks, and he scored a handful of touchdowns, 4 touchdowns before missing time. So Jahan Dotson is another guy that I feel like if that volume is consistent, could be a guy that can give you a little bit of a boost in the fantasy playoffs. Marquise Brown returned from injury week 12 and immediately saw 8 targets. 3 weeks in 6 appearances before injury, he scored over 20 fantasy points, showing his connection with his former college quarterback in Kyler Murray. I'll be curious to see J.K. Dobbins. Is he going to return this week? He should be close to it. Can he come back? Can he come back healthy and be a guy that people can utilize in the fantasy playoffs? Just knowing that we've had the running back position get banged up and have had some guys be disappointing this season. Another rookie, 8 touchdowns across Christian Watson's last 4 games. Clear fantasy riser there. Wide receiver 3 across these last 4 games, averaging 24.8 points per game. Freak athlete just being unleashed by Aaron Rodgers. A couple guys to keep your eyes on too as we near the playoffs. Donovan Peoples-Jones showing receiving yard upside throughout the entire year, and now he has a chance to have even more of a fantasy boost with Deshaun Watson once that rust gets kicked off. Michael Gallup, who continues to stay heavily involved, is getting further from his injury, and I feel like seeing his fantasy points scoring trending up is a good sign for things to come. We've seen good days out of guys like Zay Jones. He's had a good connection with Trevor Lawrence. He just exploded in week 12. Nico Collins has been consistently targeted for Houston, even though they struggle. So just a few guys to keep eyes on. Maybe they're sleepers, but handful of notes there about guys trending up. Matchups will definitely be huge when it comes to the fantasy playoffs, and I'm sure the Fantasy Point staff and myself will drop content on who does have plus matchups. It's already on the site, I know that, but more content to come there. But this week, it's a huge week in general for fantasy football managers because a lot of those standings are up for grabs. I know in a home league that I run, there's like one spot actually solidified, which is crazy. In 2 different divisions, the top 3 go in each division, and only one spot is completely solidified. That just goes to show you as an example how much this week 14 is going to impact the fantasy playoffs. So good luck this week, guys. Hopefully you can take away something from the podcast today. Go get those W's, and you will do so if you are a Fantasy Point subscriber.